Let me take you back a few weeks when I was working on my most recent video. In an effort to collect my thoughts on the matter, I decided to gauge what other people's opinions were. I checked different forums, YouTube comment sections, and forced myself to go on Reddit, to which I found this post and this comment underneath it. Quote, "In Hartlepool in northern England, they allegedly hanged a monkey having mistaken it for a Frenchman. Latterly, they adopted Hengist the monkey as a mascot for the local football team and elected it for mayor 3 times." When you're just minding your own business, doing research for whatever, this is the psychological equivalent to a flashbang. And upon seeing this, I resolved that once I finished that video, this would be the next case I looked into. And it was a lot more complicated than I expected it to be. In my weeks of researching this case, I've heard this story told in a lot of different ways, and through that I've developed kind of my own rendition of the story, which I think is pretty inclusive to all the viewpoints. And I suppose I'll try and lean into the storytelling aspect of this for you. Okay. Over 200 years ago, amidst the fear that Napoleon's France inspired across Britain, was the humble fishing town of Hartlepool. Like many of the island's coastal residents, this town also was dutifully watching its shores for spies and invaders, and in these perilous times of war, their paranoia would soon be validated, as one night they saw the lights of a ship struggling in the waters beyond their bay, and after diligently monitoring it until daybreak, the wreck of the vessel would come to meet them on the beach. Now in front of them, the ship was clearly of French, no, Napoleonic origin, but alas, the need to worry was not, for none had lived but one. A simple monkey, adorned in the same French uniform as its now deceased crewmates, and the more isolated townsfolk, having never seen either a monkey or a Frenchman, nor having heard the French language itself, confused the appearance and chattering of the monkey for the characteristics of the French people themselves. Suspecting the unfortunate primate of espionage on behalf of Napoleon, they interrogated it, they even put it on trial, but time after time all they heard were the same shrieks and chatters. Unable to relieve their suspicions and fearing the unknown intentions of the stranger, they, having deciphered no objections, sentenced the monkey to die by hanging, and either on the beach on which it landed, or in the town square as a warning to all, it is said that out of the wood of its very own ship, gallows were constructed, and upon them the monkey would struggle and climb and fight, but like all who are sent to the rope, if you do not perish quickly, all that means is that you will die slow. And thus, in the town of Hartlepool, England, the fisherman hung the monkey. Alright, all that. A little goofy and out there, I know, which is why even if you don't research this case at all, it's still pretty common to just dismiss it at face value, which I get. The logistics of this case are quite dubious. The most immediate question is, could someone of the time actually mistake a monkey for a Frenchman? To give it as much benefit of the doubt as possible, in a lot of the contemporary propaganda, specifically Napoleon and, sometimes France in general, they were depicted as like these scrawny little monkeys. One of Napoleon's derogatory nicknames was, the Corsican monkey. And, in fairness to the townsfolk, if you don't recognize their language or, what they look like, but you do recognize the uniform, perhaps you could do a little oopsie. In theory, at least. But to drop my facade of optimism, in practice, it's not happening. And even if you do take it seriously, all it takes is one other French soldier to wash up on shore in order to disprove their suspicion. Now, behind this, there is a deeper and more grim undertone to this story, and it is the debate that the monkey that was being hung in the story was actually a powder monkey. I presume you're unfamiliar with the term, so let me explain. It is a position on the ship where you are designated to transport the gunpowder into the cannons. It was quite an unsafe occupation and often required being able to kind of squeeze into tighter spaces. And because of that, they would often employ children to do it. So if you're following the thread here, then it is very possible that a child washed on shore who filled the position of a powder monkey on ship. And as the tale got passed down, the powder part of the name got dropped and it was just left assumed to be a monkey. So for the rest of the video, I too will just presume it was a monkey. Partly because that is the assumption to which everyone else pretty much talks about the case, and it would be kind of annoying if I butted in every time, like, oh, don't forget it could have been a child too. But also just to keep the mood a little lighter. This story has some inherently goofy elements, and I want it to feel goofy most of the time. If you want to keep that in the back of your head, go ahead. But with that said, back to it. So, even when I was just pondering over this case, I had a little thought, and it's, how difficult is it to actually hang a monkey? Turns out, in theory, I think it would actually kind of be tough to do right. I looked at the Army's guide for how to execute someone by hanging, and for these calculations I'm using the Barbary macaque. It's in the Mediterranean, it has some proximity to France, so I thought it would be a reasonable option for French sailors to use. They can weigh anywhere between 15 and 25 pounds, which is actually on the heavier side for most monkey species, and for this calculation I'm using 20 pounds. Going by human body weight examples, for drop distance, even a conservative estimate is something like 14 or 15 feet for a clean neck break. But of course a shorter distance could still of course hurt them. But it would be odd for a small town like this to have gallows capable of doing that. Never underestimate human ingenuity, though, when it comes to killing things. Another problem the hypothetical executioners would have faced is that monkeys are substantially heavier in their upper body than their lower body, which really affects the mechanics of hanging something. To a point where, especially if this was a lighter species of monkey, if you tied the noose around the neck, it might be light enough to where if you left it to hang, it could genuinely not be asphyxiated by the choking. And monkeys, being the climbers that they are, could just climb back up the rope if they didn't bind their hands and feet well enough. Which is probably why in some variations of the story I heard, the monkey did kinda climb around for a bit and evade the executioners. And by now you might be thinking, well, okay, that doesn't matter. This is a story. Things like that could get left out. So, do you have any evidence? Is there, some newspaper accounts, witness statements, some physical evidence perhaps? Nah, I ain't got nothing. Aside from one piece of evidence I'll get to here in a moment, everything about this case is just hearsay. There is no, I was there and I saw this, and this. There are no record of missing French ships that should have been there at the time. In Historic England's Unpathed Waters database, shout out to them, they helped out a lot, among their record of 38,000 shipwrecks in Hartlepool in the time period of the Napoleonic Wars, I found no record of a French ship or even any of unknown origin that crashed by the town within those years. So, why does this story even exist, then? Well, that honor can be accredited to this song. The Fisherman Hung the Monkey O, by Edward Ned Corvin. Although published in 1862, it is generally agreed that in Hartlepool he performed it as early as 1854 or 1855. The song is quite long, so I won't pain you with trying to read the Old British English, or even more horrifically, I could sing it to you, but I won't do that. But the synopsis of it is pretty similar to the story I told earlier, maybe a little less detailed, but the beats are the same. Here is a written note accompanying the song. The fisherman hung the monkey O. These words are the greatest insult you can offer to the Hartlepool fishermen. It is supposed when Napoleon the Great threatened to invade England, the fishermen were loyal and patriotic, and ever on the lookout for spies. A vessel having been wrecked about this time, all on board perished with the exception of a monkey, which was seized by the fisherman for a French spy and hung because he could not or would not speak English. So yeah, as I said, pretty similar, and this is the first documentation of the case. And thus, our only source is a comedic song written decades after the hypothesized incident by a guy born about a generation after the hypothesized incident. Now, to my brothers and sisters from the States, or really anywhere that isn't Britain, you probably haven't heard of this case before, but from what I can grasp from the country's media, this seems to be one of those, oh, well, everyone knows that kind of stories, especially the closer you get to Hartlepool. So, how does something that I would consider to have pretty weak evidence become a presumed to be true story by many of the locals? A lot of it comes down to an argument for absurdity, that a story like this wouldn't just pop up out of nowhere. However, in researching this case, I discovered 4 stories that I think have the potential to subvert that claim, that this story didn't actually just pop up out of nowhere. You see, although I don't believe anyone will ever prove or disprove Corvin's tale, we can speculate the various degrees to which the story was inspired, which, depending on the conclusion you arrive to, can serve the purpose of strengthening or weakening the credibility of Corvin's song. According to these 4 stories, potential inspirations for monkey-related stories existed long before Corvin wrote his piece in 1855. Let's meet these possible progenitors. The first, and probably least relevant of these, is The Monkey Barber, 1825, written in probably Edinburgh by an unknown author, and has potentially, probably, racist undertones. I'm not going to bother reading it all out to you, but if you want to pause and read it, go ahead. But here's my synopsis of it. In Liverpool, a newly immigrated Irishman goes to a barber, and upon entering the shop, he sees a monkey, but he, presuming it to be the actual barber, still asks for his hair to be cut. He gets angry and starts causing a bit of chaos in the surrounding streets. This is a very dumb tangent, but I have no choice but to tell somebody. So, apparently, this appeared in Edgar Allan Poe's personal collection of stories, and it shares a few striking similarities with one of his works, The Murders in Rue Morgue, 1841, which is kind of considered to be the first modern detective story, meaning that this 1825 shitpost making fun of Irish people could be considered partially responsible for the existence of Sherlock Holmes and all other stories in the genre. Had to let you know that one. You're welcome. The next 2 I kind of grouped together. They go by the name The Sandhill Monkey and The Baboon. They were both published in 1827 and appeared in the same Newcastle Songbook in 1942, which was just a collection of local folk songs from the time. And some of their origin is elaborated on in another local songbook from 1891. To give a brief synopsis of The Sandhill Monkey, it is pretty similar to the Monkey Barber story. Actually, it's a man entering a shop, and he attempts to buy something from the monkey, who he assumes to be the shopkeep. Him, not being able to properly purchase things from the monkey, just starts arguing with the locals, and the story is really that simple. Some people try and date the story to 1783 due to a mention of a crow's nest. I don't really get what all the talk is about. The story really isn't that important, the author is unknown, and I promise things will get interesting soon. A final story before I get to what I really want to talk about is The Baboon, and as I said, it's from the same year. The story features a group of Cossacks, which, as far as I can determine, seem to be just Russian cowboys, if I'm correct. Anyway, they visit England with a pet baboon alongside them, who is running around the street causing a ruckus, and it gets mistaken for a person. Written by Thomas Armstrong, the song actually goes to the same tune as The Fisherman Hung the Monkey-O, called The Tinker's Wedding. That's all I got for that song. After hearing those 3 accounts, you might be thinking, okay, this is neat, but they don't seem that relevant. You could say that they use similar diction, reference a few similar things, and one even plays the same tune, but the story told by Corvin is incredibly unique, and it doesn't even matter that those more performance-y characteristics are inspired. That's what artists do, and the content of the story, what actually matters in this debate, does not seem inspired, outside of the fact that a monkey is mistaken for a human, which is a fairly minor thing. That is similar to my thought process. But I had to address these stories by the merit that people do use them to try and discredit the validity of the song. But even early on, I knew that diving into these as much as I did was a little frivolous. I'll admit it. These stories really only exist to introduce and potentially support our fourth and final story in this case. The only one that has truly had a chance at challenging Hartlepool's claim to the story. Let me introduce you to the small town of Boddam, who has their own dark little secret hiding in the northeast of Scotland. This is my rendition of the story. Long ago, at the time of 1772, in the far northeast of Scotland, Langenwaite was the small town of Boddam. As they went about their duties, fishing, farming, building, harvesting, etc., there was always the hope, or potentially the instigation, for a treasure to arrive on shore, one that would ease their burdens. What is this treasure? Well, it is the beached wreck of an unoccupied ship, and in this story, the role of that ship was filled by one thought to be named the Annie. The town, having this vessel arrive on their shores, they boarded it, seeking to salvage what they could from it. But among the rubble, they met a problem. You see, nearly 100 years earlier, in the case of Jacobson versus the Earl of Crawford, January 20th, 1674, a precedent was set among the Scottish courts that, if among a shipwreck there was any living creature, man or beast, the vessel could not be plundered for salvage, and, if possible, the owner was to be notified. And because of this ruling, when they found a monkey, it became a problem to be exterminated. The primate ran up the mast of the ship trying to evade the townsfolk, but in the end they seized this unfamiliar creature and quickly killed it via hanging, some supposedly claiming that it was even the devil. Despite its treatment and accusations, some say that they still gave the monkey a Christian burial. And thus, the Boddamers hung the monkey. I just realized that perhaps I should clarify something real quick. You might be wondering why I'm writing my own version of the story instead of just reading you the song. One, the English used is very hard to decipher. Something a lot of the writers did, they didn't write the word, they wrote the phonetics of the word when they were putting their songs down, which makes it really hard for me because they're using British slang too, which I'm not very familiar with. And two, it is my attempt to kind of amalgamate everything I hear about the story. Of course, the songs themselves are the most important thing, but I am also trying to include kind of the local folklore I hear about it. The songs themselves, I already consider those folklore, so all I'm doing is just adding more folklore, which I don't really think dilutes the purity of the case at all. I just thought it would make it easier for you, the viewer, to understand it if I did it this way. And also, I like storytelling, so why not do this? Still, after this video is over, I do recommend looking up covers of it on YouTube, since you can find them. Like the previous case in Hartlepool, let's start by examining the logistics of the story itself. First, like last time, the mechanics of hanging a monkey are still difficult. That's not changing, but the thing that really makes it interesting to me are the change in motives. In Hartlepool, the driving force of the story is the stupidity of the towngoers. Meanwhile, in Boddam, they are simply following their incentives. You could say they didn't have to kill the monkey, instead just taking the goods, but then you have to explain to travelers how you got the monkey. So even then I think that it is still strategically intelligent to just kill it. This difference, I believe, at least makes the story itself much more possible. You can more easily expect people to kill an animal for monetary or legal incentives. I mean, average people do that every day. Hanging is still kind of crazy, though. Than out of mistaking them for an enemy spy. And similar to the town of Hartlepool, Boddam also has a historical song accompanying it. Unlike Hartlepool, however, there is no standard version of the song, and on top of that is both shorter in length and detail in my opinion. But it does use extremely similar dialogue choice, and it plays by the same tune as the Hartlepool song. And synoptically, it is just a simplified story. Boat crashes onto shore, people find a monkey, people hang monkey, and depending on the variant, maybe a few more specific details. It is essentially the same song, the same story, just applied to a different group of people. And similar to Hartlepool, there isn't that much tangible evidence. No newspapers, books, or journal entries documenting it. No quotes from anyone at the time to back it up. At first I thought there was some evidence for a shipwreck, because it is listed there on the database I'm using. But the evidence listed for why it's there is that it's a traditional tale, so I'm glad I dug into that a little bit more. So, in reality, the Annie is just as anecdotal as any other unique part of the story, but I do think it is still interesting that a supposed name of it was passed down. This kind of brings me to a point where we are at a fork in the road here. One of these stories has to be an original, and the other is almost certainly derived from it. Let's analyze some of the Boddam story's evidence. First, the dating, and a little disclaimer here. Many of these anecdotes come from books I do not have access to, and I am forced to rely on the quotation of other authors, and authors quoting other authors. One of the more important sources which helped me out in this part specifically was a correspondence I found between two authors going by Mr. Thomas and Ambrose Merton. And they led me to figuring out that the first actual documentation of this incident occurring in Boddam was actually really later than you expect. Coming from local historian Cuthbert Graham in 1965, he is quoted as saying, "And the Boddamers hung the monkey." I don't know the exact context for it, but this is the first time it was uniquely identified in Boddam. However, the supposed inspiration for that statement comes from a book of regional folk songs compiled over many decades, Sholtham, Shaw, and Lyle, 1981, another book I don't have access to. The chorus of the song, the part that goes, "And the blanks hanged the monkey, oh," it doesn't say Boddam, it says fisherman, exactly like the Hartlepool version. And the note accompanying it, dated August of 1907, explicitly says it happened in another place. Quote, "Cullen fisherman who sang it told of a ship running ashore of Banffshire. All the crew were drowned, a monkey was saved. Fishermen, unable to place the creature, hanged it." So despite any pre-20th century documentation of the story in Boddam, it is still considered a piece of history there by many of the residents, largely out of a sense of tradition, which I still do think matters, but in determining the truth, I'd like a little more. And you can find as many quotes as you want of people, largely in the later 1900s when researching things like this became more accessible, saying that they heard the story from their grandfather and that this was passed down from his father. But even with all that being true, it doesn't get you anywhere past, like, the 1890s. So how did this story get to Boddam, assuming that it isn't true? You could take the reference to Banffshire, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, seriously, but since I can't find a single other mention linking the story there, I see it more as evidence of the story kind of telephoning its way up the east coast of Britain, each fisherman going, "Oh, well I heard that story from here," or a little more carelessly, "Oh, well I heard the story happened here." There was a practice among some northeastern Scottish fishermen that during the herring off-season, you would travel down to English waters, like where Hartlepool is, and fish there for a time. There had always been a sharing of folk songs and stories up and down Britain's east coast, but this expedited that process, and people have used it as evidence to argue for both pro-Hartlepool and pro-Boddam opinions on the matter. As far as I've been able to determine, the practice began in the 1860s in very small numbers, but by the 1890s and early 20th century, it became more normalized. Okay, I believe that is actually all the raw evidence for the history around this case. There are a lot of opinions on the matter, I'll tell you which one I adhere to in a minute, but I've prepared a few charts to help summarize this all. A little thing I have to get out of the way here first is that, for the sake of your time, I am limiting some of the speculation on this case. There are actually many other spots that are theorized monkey hanging locations. Every single thing in this case is already hearsay, and if this is hearsay, I don't even know what to consider them. Here is a brief list of the possible locations I've seen. To quote a conveniently summarized list from the already mentioned Ambrose Merton and Mr. Thomas, possible other locations are Greenock, Megavissey, Rowerdon, Derbyshire, Dorset, Kent, and the already mentioned Banffshire. Back to the graphs. Now, all of these viewpoints can be laid out relative to how we want to place Ned Corvin. The only reason I believe this story is even remembered is because Ned Corvin sung and wrote down this song. After researching this case for as long as I have, I believe that it doesn't even matter where the incident happened. Whatever the story was, it had to go through Ned or be forgotten. To start with, probably the easiest opinion to have is that everything that he wrote about in Hartlepool is 100% true, which basically means that Corvin travels to Hartlepool, hears the story, writes a song. It becomes really popular there, largely because the western industrial Hartlepool wanted a way to make fun of the older fishing-focused Hartlepool. The story gets a few decades to marinate there and kind of root itself, but as the century begins to close and those fisheries from the north start to move down to England, they take a liking to the story and they bring it back home and it starts to become a part of their culture. It becomes adapted to different towns up there, but for whatever reason, it becomes really attached to Boddam. Probably because of their rivalry with Burnhaven, who wanted a reason to make fun of them. So, despite there being an actual truth to the story, because of a lot of petty town rivalries, in the end, we are left with confusion. The second most popular theory, that what actually happened in Boddam is true, requires a bit more to happen. First, the actual event, but in this timeline, it never gets written down and remains a verbal tradition of the region. Ned Corvin, during his travels in Scotland, because he did do that, here's the story. He thinks it's good material for a comic song, but not willing to go so far out of his way up to the north of Scotland, for whatever reason decides that Hartlepool is a good place to use his imagination on. He adapts the story to the town, probably using a mix of inspiration from the already mentioned Monkey Barber, Baboon, and Sandhill Monkey stories. It becomes a bit of a hit. West Hartlepool latches onto the song to make fun of old Hartlepool. Similar to the other timeline, it travels back up the east coast, some of the fluff getting removed along the way, to which the song takes advantage of those already established roots of the story in the area, and the locals apply what remains of the Hartlepool song to Boddam. So, in this timeline, despite the first account of a monkey being hung seemingly happening in Hartlepool, that story is just an inspiration of what happened in Boddam, and everyone is left in confusion. Another possible scenario is that they're both true. So Corvin, perhaps he did hear the story in his travels in Scotland, maybe he didn't, but in this timeline, that doesn't really matter because he just hears the story that the Hartlepool folk are telling him and bases his song off of that story. That song travels up the east coast again, similarly to the other stories, and the same sequence of events happens as if it were just the Boddam-only timeline. And in this version, despite both stories potentially being inspired by each other, both are simultaneously true, and we are left confusing ourselves in a meaningless debate. Another possible timeline is that there is no truth, with perhaps some slight inspiration from those three smaller stories I keep mentioning. In this story, he just makes it all up, and it proceeds as if it were just the Hartlepool timeline. I guess a variation of even that is that the story just gets made up in Boddam, and it just follows the Boddam timeline, despite it not even being true at all. You could categorize some other stuff into just an other timeline, where it proceeds as the no-truth timeline, except there's a piece of inspiration that we're just not aware about. Because, a monkey could have been hanged in a place that we have no knowledge of, and He just happened to pin that story on Hartlepool for whatever reason, which that is kind of a whole asterisk on this entire case. It is completely reasonable to assume that other things may have influenced Corvin to write the song the way he did. I'm doing my best to connect the dots I have, but I also recognize that I probably don't have all the dots. Another asterisk I should probably kind of put over all of this is that even in each variation, even if a monkey was actually hung there, that doesn't mean the song is 100% true. An obvious example is that even if a monkey was hung in Hartlepool, that doesn't mean that they had to mistake the monkey for a French person. In each of these different timelines, the story could be partially inspired or only partially true about certain things. These stories were supposed to be inherently comedic. They're supposed to exaggerate. That is their purpose. But with that said, I personally adhere to a inspired Hartlepool timeline in which a monkey was hung there, but certain elements of the story were exaggerated or borrowed from other stories. But probably nothing happened in Boddam, in my opinion. Hope you were able to follow with that. As I wrap this video up, I want to talk about Hartlepool a little bit more, and more so how the story has persisted into the modern age. Believe it or not, in my earliest phase of research for this video, I hypothesized that this would actually be the most interesting part of the video. And I really had no idea what I was getting myself into. And the reason I thought what Hartlepool is doing right now is so interesting is because just how heavily it contrasts with a town featured in my last video, Erwin, Tennessee. See, they, in 1916, they got a little kooky and decided to hang an elephant. And because of that, the town has always been kind of plagued by a sense of shame and guilt, and nowadays there is a desire to make up for it. To keep it brief, they do not take any pride in the event. Hartlepool is the exact opposite of that. For them, it is a source of pride, and part of me thinks that might come down to it being less recent for them. Because in the past, they were apparently heavily mocked for it, and they still are today a bit, but it's their attitude that's changed. Originally, it was something used to provoke them. Now it's something that they apparently kind of rally around. Remember, there was a note below the original song that read, "The fisherman hung the monkey-o is the worst insult you can offer a Hartlepool fisherman." I don't really know when, but at some point they embraced it. From what I can tell, a lot of the things in the town are named after it. Notably, their football club, named the Monkey Hangers, with their mascot Hangus the Monkey. Even more insane, in 2002, during the town's first mayoral election, the operator of that mascot, Stuart Drummond, ended up winning the race on the promise of free bananas for all school children, which he failed to accomplish, and despite that, he was re-elected 3 times afterwards. From what I can tell, this is kind of just a protest vote. The town didn't want a mayor, so they just kept electing him because didn't want an actual politician, and that's why sometime during his 3rd term, a referendum was held and the position of mayor was removed from the town. This is something I didn't really get into earlier, but a big part of them owning the story the way they have, I think, is a rivalry the town had with itself, ironically, in a way. You see, the place the monkey was supposedly hung would be considered Old Hartlepool there. And with West Hartlepool, the town that mocked them, the two of them would eventually grow enough in size to where that whole area is just considered Hartlepool now. Of course, the locals will still try and make distinctions, but I, an outsider, I don't really care though. They're all monkey hangers to me, but in a loving way. And this is sorta mirrored in Boddam. I tried to kind of point it out earlier, but to clarify, Boddam was an indigenous town to the area, and Burnhaven a planned, more industrial town, and thus always kind of got bullied by them for being less advanced, if you'd say that. And this story played a huge part in propagating that in the local culture up there. Unlike the Hartlepools, these towns haven't become close to merging at all, and Boddam overall isn't really as well known for this story. Maybe if you're local you probably do, but in line with that, they also haven't owned the story nearly as much as Hartlepool did. And there's one more thing I gotta mention just in case anyone was wondering why I didn't In 2005, a bone washed up on shore, and the whole town kind of got excited that it was a monkey bone. It looked really old and caused a lot of interest, but it ended up originating from a 6,000-year-old deer skeleton, which is still pretty cool in my opinion, but it would have been cool if it was a monkey. And I'm pretty sure it's on like display in the town now or something, in a museum or something. So, with that all said, the story is over. Thank you for watching. Really appreciate it. I hope I was able to make your time and attention worth it. Just to ramble a bit here, I wish I did get this video out, like, honestly, I could have done it a week ago if I worked on it a bit more. But I kind of got lazy, so I got my life in a little bit more order now, so perhaps I will be able to actually get something out next week. I don't know who cares, but if you do, hopefully it'll be probably the latter half of next week. I'm gonna try and do something that's not animal abuse related. Believe it or not, despite these two videos, I do not have aspirations of becoming an animal abuse documentarian. I don't know what I'm gonna do next week, but I'm setting myself a no animal abuse rule. Alright, I think I'm done. Thank you for watching again. Really thank you. And have a blessed day.